Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We will be starting shortly at 3 o'clock sharp. So bear with us while we wait for more participants to join in.
In the call. Okay.
Okay, it's 3 o'clock. We will be starting now. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's session on the implementation of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. My name is Joel. I am a manager at the Climate Change and Sustainability Services Department from EY, based here in Malaysia, and I'll be your MC for today. So today's program is organized by the Joint Committee on Climate Change, also known as the JC3 and HSBC Amanah. So the session is supported by the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program, a UK government-funded program and delivered by EY. So today's session will be recorded and uploaded on IFIM's YouTube channel for your subsequent consumption. So this program is part of the JC3 Skilling Sustainability Training Series. So today's program is on governance and reporting. So the main objective for this program is to provide an overview of the regulatory trends on climate-related requirements and disclosures, and understand the key principles and recommendations of TCFD. We are also looking at identifying practical approaches to implement the TCFD recommendations and learn from leading practices on TCFD disclosures. There will be 2 sessions within the program, and today is the first session. So today's session will focus more on the introductory on what's TCFD and the requirements of the TCFD application guide, which was published by the JC3 recently, and leading practices on the recommended disclosures. While tomorrow's session will focus more on practical approaches to implement TCFD, and there will be a panel discussion session tomorrow by practitioners to share on their experience and journey. So it is a fairly holistic approach that we are taking. We'll cover some of these questions that you might have, some of the concerns that you might have. So we have a lineup of esteemed speakers for this program, and I will introduce them along the sessions today and tomorrow. So the webinar today is from 3 to 5:30 with a 10 minutes break in between. So we will start with an opening remark from Wendy Sun, the CFO of HSBC Malaysia, followed by a presentation by Arina, partner from EY, on the overview of TCFD. And there will be a sharing session by a representative from Bank Negara and also Bursa to share a bit more on the regulatory views in relation to climate-related disclosures. So there will be Ms. Long and Ms. Sun, respectively, that will be taking over the session later on. So then we will continue by Arina, where she will continue to share on the TCFD recommendations and leading examples of how you can disclose TCFD using the TCFD recommendations. So there will be some polling questions during the webinar. You are welcome to participate in the polling questions. So all attendees are also required to take part in the webinar feedback at the end of the session. So should you have any questions at any time during the session, you can click on the Q&A button on the screen on top of your toolbar. Click on the Q&A and you can post your questions there. So during the Q&A session, I will be directing some of the questions to the speakers, and also some of my colleagues will be helping us to answer some of these questions in the Q&A box itself. So without further ado, we will kickstart today's session with an opening remark by Wendy Sun. So Wendy is the Chief Financial Officer of HSBC Malaysia. She is responsible for managing all aspects of the finance function and providing strategic advice and insights to senior fellow stakeholders on the executive committee and local board. So prior to her current role, she has held many finance senior roles within HSBC Group, including Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and China. So during her leadership-driven career, she has proved her ability to deliver measurable results with her professionalism and enthusiasm, along with her strong people and decision-making skills. Wendy radiates a sincere passion for delivering value and benefits to her stakeholders at all levels. Wendy is also a strong supporter of these ESG initiatives. So without further ado, I pass it over to you, Wendy, for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Joe. Hello, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to you all for taking the time to attend today's Just Series training session. Implementation of Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, is the second installment under the governance and reporting theme for the Just training series of the JC3, led by Bank Negara Malaysia and Securities Commission Malaysia. This training session aims to provide an overview of the regulatory trends on climate-related requirements and disclosures around the region, as well as to discuss practical approaches to aspects of governance, strategy, scenario analysis, and risk management based on the TCFD recommendations. TCFD, as you know, is an internationally recognized disclosure framework that is established to focus on the effects of climate change on companies. TCFD is key for a company's sustainability strategy and resilience, and will further build trust between investors and customers. This training session also seeks to complement the TCFD application guide for Malaysian financial institutions released by JC3 in June this year. These initiatives are in line with Bank Negara's guidance that TCFD publications will be made mandatory among conventional and also Islamic banks by year-end 2024. It is coming very soon. Recently, having published HSBC Amanah's second voluntary TCFD report, HSBC Malaysia is supportive of industry initiatives to strengthen climate risk-related disclosures. As Malaysian financial institutions embark on this journey, we recognize that our planet urgently needs drastic and lasting action to protect our communities, businesses, and natural environment from the damaging effects of climate change. Our ability to steer finance for the transformation of businesses and infrastructure will be key in helping to enable the transition to a net zero global economy. At the core of it as well is how financial institutions report this information to be meaningful to various stakeholders that rely on this information. As a key organizer of this event, we at HSBC hope that participants will be able to gain knowledge and insights on overview of the regulatory trends around the region, key principles and recommendations by TCFD, practical approaches to implement the TCFD recommendations, and leading practices on TCFD disclosures. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, climate promises and plans must be turned into reality and action now. It is now time for us to play our part as the financial services sector provides the link between the business community with lenders and capital markets to begin the process of providing climate-related financial disclosures for the benefit of the planet and our stakeholders. Before I end my lengthy speech, I would like to extend our appreciation to the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Programme funded by the UK government, which has been supporting this JC3 SC4 initiative. I really hope all the participants will be able to internalize this training session and be able to translate that into meaningful key actions to be developed in your respective institutions. Thank you very, very much, and I hope you enjoy the training session. Thank you. Over to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So next, we will have Arena. So a partner and also EY Malaysia's Climate Change Sustainability Services leader, to share on the overview of TCFD recommendations. Arena is no stranger to many within the sustainability and climate change scene in Malaysia. She is a thought leader on sustainability and has participated in many events and conferences within the region to share her wisdom and inspire organizations to transit to a low carbon economy. So she will be presenting in this session and also the later sessions on leading practices on climate-related disclosures. So without taking too much time, over to you, Arina.
Thanks, Joel, and thank you, Wendy, for the opening. So let's get into the overview of TCFD recommendations. The first part, before we kickstart, we have a quick polling question. First is, how would you rate your understanding of TCFD recommendations? It's critical that we also get an alignment from quite a number of participants here we have today, so that we can also streamline addressing those who are in the, who have some knowledge, and those who have good knowledge, and those who are experts in TCFD. I wouldn't say that any of us here are all experts. We are all advancing on TCFD as well. So definitely we will want to gauge from the few hundreds of participants that we have here, what's the landscape. So maybe I'll pause for a while for everyone to provide the feedback. Okay, Joel. So here we can see 30% is not very, it has responded with what is TCFD. So 100 overview, it will be your first time potentially to understand TCFD. About 59 to 60% have some knowledge, and 11% have good knowledge. So maybe we'll proceed to kickstart. So when it comes to what is TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, in a very simplified layman understanding is, we all understand that climate change is a very big buzzword when it comes to, it could be a very high, broad level, but when it comes to what it means to us down to the financial and the granular level is, how does this climate affect the financial numbers, not from the governmental to regulatory to policies down to the enterprise and asset and facility level. So to some extent, when we look at why this task force was set up, it is to also provide an alignment and a tool to ensure that all organizations start to have a certain disclosures that is connected to financial, and they're able to converse on climate-related disclosures in a manner that is consistent, that can be understood when everyone looks at TCFD disclosures. They can see a certain relativity when they actually compare report by reports, and that will also be user-friendly for readers. So climate change is definitely, all of us can relate and understand, from the number of floods, sea level rise, or the changing weather patterns, the heat that has happened, irregular or more regular floods that has happened. We all know that this affects, even in Malaysia, the 5 states that have monsoon season floods and all. And then we also understand that given this climate change is a threat, because we have disaster recovery, we have damages caused to corporates and all, companies are really responding to this risk. Investors are looking at how resilient businesses are when it comes to climate risk. Regulators and other users are also looking at what's the cost now to business, of what's the cost to action in action when it comes to climate risk. So the TCFD, or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, it was established in 2015 by G20's Financial Stability Board to better understand and promote disclosure when it comes to climate-related financial risks and opportunities. The key word is climate, financial, risk, and opportunity. So these are the 4 key words to remember when it comes to TCFD. The next part I wanted to outline, yeah, it's not moving. Okay, so when it comes to breaking down to TCFD, these are the 4 circles that is commonly remembered. The 4 core elements, you see that governance is the overarching outer circle because that's where the most enterprises have set their foundation, very much premised on governance. So when it comes to governance, the key thing to remember is the organizations needs to now consider what are the governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. Now, in your mind, you will start to think about a number of sectors or a number of different segments of organization within an organization that will have to take ownership on governance. But it all starts with governance as a start. And then we go down to deeper discussion, which is on strategy. Now, when it comes to strategy, the context is also what are the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business strategy and financial planning. In a very layman term, it would be, for example, when it comes to forward-looking carbon taxonomy, how does that affect businesses? What are the scenarios and what are the strategies in handling, the response to potential carbon tax, for example, taxonomy. So those are one. The other part is with flood happening more frequently, what are the historical impact when it comes to the damages? What are the resilience? What are the adaptation and mitigation when it comes to strategy? So these are a few things to think about when you talk about strategy. On risk management, is to go into a further deep dive on what are the processes used by the organization to identify and assess and manage climate-related risks. So a lot of us will then start to think about what are the risk management consideration, enterprise risk management assessment processes, how does all these connect to the overarching enabler of strategy, governance, matrix, and targets. And when we go down to the down level of matrix and targets, it's also to understand what are the matrix measurable, quantifiable, or qualitative matrix and targets that will be used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So while this is just very broad concept, we have examples that we will share as we get on today's. So we save the better ones for the last, but it's to get everyone aligned first on what the concept is. One thing that is valuable from TCFD framework, it has provided the concept to allow users, investors all to understand these are the 4 key areas to look for in TCFD disclosures, but it also allows, and there are guidances provided. So if we go on to the next slide, I think it's key to outline. When we look into what TCFD recommendations provide, under this 4 pillars, these are the 11 items or 11 areas of disclosures that you typically would see in a TCFD disclosure. So for governance, very much they will ask 2 things. One is describe the board's oversight on the climate-related risks and opportunities. Whether the board discusses or don't discuss, how do they discuss? That is to a certain level, the preparers or those enterprises will now need to disclose how the board have the oversight. The second part is to describe the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. So board and management are 2 key things under governance. For strategy, there are 3 components. The first is describe what are the risks and opportunities that the organization has identified. And key point is over the short, medium, and long term. Now, why we say TCFD is a progressive? Because there is challenges identifying risks from short, medium, and long term. And how short, medium, and long term are defined individual organization by organization may differ, but a lot of organizations are moving towards 2050 as the long term or 2100 as the long term. So that gives you that idea of how this is starting to evolve. A lot of the disclosures are no longer on historical or the next 5-year business plan. There is the context of short, medium, and long term now being defined. And there are recommendations and guides in the TCFD as well. So the second part of strategy is also, once you've identified the climate-related risks and opportunities, second is to describe what are the impact of the risks and opportunities to the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. Now, a lot of organizations have started on identifying the risks to businesses, to strategy, but have not fully integrated to what it means to your financial planning. How are you going to mitigate and adapt moving forward? And the third part is describe the resilience, and this is the harder part. Describe the resilience of the organization strategy, taking into consideration different climate-related scenarios, including a 2 degrees or lower scenarios, 1.5 degrees, 4 degrees. So those are the various scenarios if the global direction is to move on different scenarios, different policies, different taxonomies, whether the carbon taxonomy anticipated is $5 per ton of CO2 or $20 per ton of CO2. Those are the different scenarios that how resilient, what's the value at risk to the assets, to the portfolio that the company has exposure to. So these are the 3 areas of strategy that organizations need to think about. For risk management, 3 things. First is, what is the processes to identify and assess climate-related risks? Second is, how are the organization managing the climate-related risks? And third is, how these processes are integrated to the overall risk management. 3 things. And for matrix and targets, on top of the matrix, second part is to also describe scope 1, scope 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gases emissions and other related risks. The third part is to also describe the targets. Now, this is very much in line with the Malaysia Code of Corporate Governance that has been updated to recommend that board also now have oversight on target setting and review performance against targets. So it's very much connected here as well. If you see TCFD, they are already asking for further prescriptive clarification on the disclosure, which is not qualitative, but quantitative. So these are the 11 items under the TCFD recommendation. If I move on to the next slide, the questions that will be asked is also why the need for TCFD. Quite a number would also be asking for what's the importance. The first part is once these disclosures are put in place, it will provide a certain level of consistency of disclosure. At this point, what we are seeing, if we take on a lot of reports, there are inadequate information about risk, and that could lead to mispricing of assets, misallocation of capital, and the concerns of financial stability. We all hear about stranded assets. We talk about stranded assets when it comes to inefficient assets, operations, buildings, plants. Those are things that will drive potential financial implications if there are inadequate information. The second part we're seeing is, given this information, it will support further action when it comes to adaptation and mitigation. So what we are seeing is creditors, investors are increasingly demanding access to risk information that is consistent, comparable, reliable, and clear. And this has been since the financial crisis 2007, 2008, where corporate governance have continuously been the highlight and have impact on shareholder value. Hence, the demand for transparency from organization on the broader risk and significant risks that the organization needs to handle. So if we look at the climate change impact on ASEAN on the right-hand side, we can see that the projected temperature rise is 1.2 to 1.6 degrees for Malaysia by 2050. Now, of course, the key critical part of this is how would this affect agriculture? How would this affect food security? How would this affect organizations that needs to handle assets in a rising temperature scenario? We are also seeing that there is an expected 0.4 to 0.6 projected rise of sea level by 2100, and 21% of significant increase in high river flows over global and land area by at 2 degrees, including Southeast Asia. So the next part we wanted to cover and outline is when we understand the context of the significance of why it's important, we also need to understand how climate-related issues will affect the important aspects of organization, financial performance and position. Because the key word is on financial performance and position. So a number of the risk that we're seeing happens when or affects an organization through two things. One is transition risk, and transition risk includes policy and legal. Technology, for example, certain technologies will become obsolete. Market, for example, when there are ban on ICE vehicles, such as in Singapore, there is already policy to ban internal combustion engine vehicles. That changes the market landscape. It sparks more EV infrastructures and EV markets. So those are things that has happened in the region. The other part is also when it comes to reputation, how are organizations building their business model and resilience in a broader ecosystem when it comes to transition risk. So when it comes to physical risk, there is the acute and the chronic. So we understand that there would be climate disasters like flood that will come, and there will be significant response required, early warning disaster mechanisms required, responsive microfinancing required when it comes to climate disasters. But there are also the longer term, slower impact from physical risks like sea level rise. How does this affect the coastal areas when there are assets that is located at coastal area? So these are the various risks when we talk about how this affect the organization. But more importantly, I think we need to also look at opportunities, because this will also drive potential understanding of where the growth areas are when it comes to these scenarios. So in terms of opportunities, there is the resource efficiency. Definitely digitalization is going to drive a number of opportunities, and this will in return support the whole infrastructure on mitigation and adaptation as well. As I mentioned, early warning mechanisms are one. Having clarity on where the risk heat maps are also important. Geographical location, all those things will drive certain resource efficiency, energy source, products or services, markets, and resilience. So there are discussions around what are the future energy generation mix looks like, transitioning away from fossil fuel to renewable energies. So those are also the opportunities. Having smart meters, smart grid that will drive energy efficiency and alternate fuel sourcing. So those are the things that would also be the opportunities that organizations will start to look at. So both risks and opportunities will need to be considered when it comes to the strategic planning, risk management, and all these needs to connect back to financial impact. So when it comes to the financial impact is to now understand how this connects to the performance, income statement, cash flow, balance sheet, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's not a simple task to connect, but we look at this slide where we have outlined the 5 key areas whereby organization will be the value proposition, where organization will be better positioned to prepare for financial risk by adopting TCFD recommendation. Now, having adopted TCFD or starting to adopt TCFD, you will find that these are the 5 benefits. The first is on risk management, because management will now have a certain processes to identify them and react and prepare and respond to it. Second is familiarization for scenario analysis. This will improve the capability in quantitative modeling and data analytics. There will be greater rigor and sophistication on using of data sets, assumptions, and supporting the definition of scenarios. Now, why this is important? because every businesses relies on understanding where the mega trends, where the key risks and policies, taxonomies are. So having the scenario analysis will help businesses to prepare for what's to come. And you are not blind, you don't have a blind spot or blindsided by some of the business as usual now that will change once policy changes. The third part is on education journey and fiduciary duty. It's critical to also note that we are seeing an enhanced, not just director awareness, but we are seeing that it is becoming more important for organizations to really look at what are the directors' roles and responsibility. We have seen that legal opinion that has been issued recently, 22nd July 2022. Malaysian company directors are legally required to incorporate climate change consideration in their decision making. So directors' legal duties could now expose them to litigation if these areas are not managed critically. And the fourth is really external communication, consistency of messaging across different external reporting mediums, having the investors, financial reporting, corporate reporting, sustainability reporting that connects, integrate, and align rather than reports that doesn't streamline. So if we go on to the next slide, is also, So the fifth part is also to shift the focus area from external stakeholders to more long-term investors. So focusing on the shift to forward-looking assumptions, methodology, opportunities, and strategy. So all these will actually help to have better understanding of the financial impact through TCFD. Despite the ongoing progress, we have come up with the EY Global Climate Barometer 2021, whereby globally we assess different organizations in different sectors on their level of maturity in adopting TCFD. And we've also looked at TCFD's 2021 status report. So despite the ongoing progress, companies are still struggling to get a grip with climate risk disclosures. Now, what we are seeing here is while banks have moved ahead, insurance, asset owners, and managements still have room to grow when it comes to coverage and especially quality. So here we have outlined that the report does go into deeper dive when it comes to where the gaps are in the disclosures for banks, insurance, and asset owners and management. So feel free to get into, you can Google EY Global Climate Barometer and you can see the details. But what we have outlined here is it has a structure, and with these percentages, everyone can have a view of where the disclosures are more leading, whether, and what we see here is risk management has better score in some areas, especially the identification and risk management. But where the challenges are and where it's very much under disclosed is resilience of strategy and what is management's role when it comes to governance. So I'll now pause and pass back to Joel. Joel, you're mute.
Sorry. Thanks, Arina. We'll get back to you on the session for later. So our next session will focus on the regulatory view on climate-related matters. So I think Arina shared quite a comprehensive view on what is TCFD, why is it important. So now we will have representative from Bank Negara and also Bursa Malaysia to share a bit more on what are the regulators' expectations in relation to TCFD disclosures. So if I could invite Ms. Long and also Ms. San to get to turn on your webcam. So I'll just give a very brief introduction on our speakers for today. So we have Ms. Long Sok Sim. She's the manager in the Prudential Financial Policy Department of Bank Negara Malaysia. So she was involved in the prudential and developmental related policy work throughout her service at Bank Negara. So currently her portfolio focuses on sustainability and climate related risks. She is currently developing this climate risk management and scenario analysis policy document and was involved in developing the VBIAF sectoral guides as well. So we also have Ms. San Mei Kim with us today. She is the sustainability lead of the Corporate Governance and Sustainability Department under the regulation at Bursa Malaysia. She oversees the development of key sustainability-related initiatives for the Malaysian capital market. So this includes putting in place enhancements to Bursa Malaysia's sustainability reporting framework, so which comprise listing requirements, sustainability reporting guides and related toolkits, as well as capacity building initiatives for all Malaysian public listed companies. So with that, I would like to hand over the session to Ms. Long and Ms. San. Feel free to share your screen on your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel, for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, I will briefly take through the key elements of the TCFD application guide that was issued by JC3 SC2, and also how it interacts with the bank expectation on climate-related disclosure. Just for context, at the 6th meeting of the Joint Committee on Climate Change, JC3, held on end 2021, the JC3 members supported the proposal for FIs to make mandatory TCFD-aligned disclosure starting from 2024. And to better guide the FIs to produce TCFD-aligned disclosures, the JC3 Subcommittee on Governance and Disclosure has developed the TCFD application guide for FIs, which translated the core elements recommended by TCFD into basic and stretch recommendations. Each of the recommendation is also complemented with the descriptions, guidance notes, key considerations, and examples for FIs to consider when they're developing their own TCFD-aligned disclosures. Based on the design of the application guide, all financial institutions will be able to minimally adopt the basic recommendations set out in the application guide within a period of up to 24 months and are encouraged to adopt stretch recommendations in line with their climate risk exposure and complexity of their operations. For financial institutions regulated by Bank Negara Malaysia, the banks and the insurers and takaful operators, we are expecting our FIs to work towards adopting stretch recommendations that are fully aligned with the TCFD disclosure by end 2024, as it reiterated in the climate risk management and scenario analysis exposure draft. The TCFD aligned disclosure is expected to first provide greater transparency on how climate-related risk considerations are integrated into business decisions and risk management of financial institutions. Second, help drive action towards more effective transition and adaptation strategies to respond to climate-related risks. And lastly, and more importantly, prepare the financial industry and relevant stakeholders to better prepare for the upcoming International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB standards, which was also built upon the recommendation of the TCFD. So in the slides, you can see that the examples of some of the recommendations and how the TCFD application guide have set out some of the guidance to assist the FIs in adopting the TCFD aligned disclosure. I will stop here and I will invite my team to take through the remaining session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Suksim. Okay, hold on. Let me just quickly share my slide. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Joel, for the kind introduction, and Suksim as well. Just quickly, first and foremost, we would like to thank the organizers for the invitation to share at this TCFD implementation workshop. And it is a very timely workshop. As mentioned by Wendy earlier, there are urgent requirements coming, and this is well timed. Okay, so let me just quickly run through. To supplement Suksim's, to echo Suksim's stance, what we can see is that globally there's actually an increased demand for better quality sustainability disclosures. This is sustainability reporting in general. Now, when we zoom to climate itself, as Arina aptly put earlier, there's actually an increased urgency to have these disclosures put in place because everyone can see the increased rain patterns, the increased temperatures, and everyone is looking how fast can we actually mitigate, how can we internalize these thoughts and get them into our businesses. So the entire regulatory system is slowly moving towards internalizing that. Now, let's just take a few steps back. So in terms of sustainability reporting, Bursa has been a proponent and continues to be a proponent of sustainability practices, good sustainability practices, as well as disclosures. In 2015, we introduced the Sustainability Reporting Framework, as you can see here, which consists of the listing requirements, the Sustainability Reporting Guide, as well as toolkits. In addition to supplement these disclosures, we actually launched a microsite called the Bursa Sustain. I strongly encourage everyone to have a look. There are actually certain materials there on TCFD that if you haven't heard about, you can go ahead and check it out. This is basically an evolving process. So as you can see, the sustainability landscape keeps evolving. And similarly, our requirements also revolve in tandem. So what happened is in 2018, we actually revamped the Sustainability Reporting Guide to put in place a few things. One is that we included references to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We actually included references to the TCFD recommendations, which is what this workshop covers today. And we also put in place further guidance for the assurance practices for companies to consider that. Now, let's look forward to what is happening now. So, in the past 2 years in particular, the sustainability space has moved at rapid pace, right? There have been increased demands, whether in terms of practices via supply chain requirements or reporting. The reporting ecosystem just keeps evolving. As Suksim mentioned earlier, the ISSB came into fruition, and we're looking at the convergence of all the reporting requirements. So, what Bursa did is that earlier in this year, sometime between March to May, we actually submitted for public consultation our proposed enhancements to our revamped sustainability reporting framework. Now, amongst the items that we actually proposed in terms of the revamp is that to mandate a set of common material sustainability matters across all listed issuers, sector-specific material matters for the main market listed issuers. In relation to these so-called material matters and their indicators, we're actually looking to have 3 years of data at least, targets for these indicators, and as well as the prescribed format, disclosure in a prescribed format at the end of the report. Now you can see that the requirements are coming. We can see that, data is a big thing. On the climate front, actually, for TCFD, we're actually looking to have the main market have climate-related disclosures in line with the TCFD recommendations, and the ACE market to have a basic plan to transition so that they also internalize these requirements. Now, this work is actually highly complementary to the work that Bursa Malaysia does as the chair of JC3 Subcommittee 2. I'm sure that everyone is aware, we are actually just talking about the TCFD application guide for Malaysian FIs that was launched in June. On this regard, we would like to really express significant gratitude to the members of Subcommittee 2 because of their significant contribution to the development of this guide. To put it in perspective, this is a guide that was developed by preparers for preparers. Therefore, these are people who have trial, so please have a look at it, and there are examples inside. It's just a good read. Now, if we look at how the synergies interplay between what we do in Bursa's reporting framework versus how we complement the role that we play as the chair of Subcommittee 2, you can see that basically as financial institutions take on the TCFD reporting, they definitely will need data points from businesses, whether big or small. So in the case of listed issuers, we are hoping these requirements will facilitate the availability of information for the Malaysian FIs. All in all, together with the points raised by Suksim, This encompasses in brief the regulatory overview at present. And with this, we wish everyone a fruitful workshop. And Arina, back to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Long and also Ms. Sun. Actually, I have a question. Well, I think it's just to, there were questions that were directed to both of you. I think maybe Ms. Long could take this question. So the question is a non-listed FI required to have the TCFD disclosure at the FI level? Is the disclosure at group level sustainability statement sufficient? So yeah, I think this cuts across, it is a FI, but it's also non-listed, whether are they required, to comply with the TCFD application guide? Are they required to disclose?
Yeah, this is also a frequently asked questions during our consultation for our exposure draft for our climate risk management and scenario analysis exposure draft. So for that, in general, what we see is that it's very important if the group disclosure will need to ensure that any disclosure that any entity is disclosing is including domestic level information. I think that's the first principle that we are looking at. So if you are a global FI that is not listed in Malaysia, and therefore you have a disclosure, say, in other country, which does not have anything, which does not have domestic entity level information, that would not be sufficient. So that is what we will also clarify in our final policy document feedback statement. The more detailed clarification can be expected in the feedback statement that we'll be issuing likely in third quarter this year.
Okay, thank you very much, Soksim. Thank you very much, Miki. So we'll move on to the next session for today. So again, I'll invite Arina back for today's for the next session. So the next session will focus a bit more on TCFD, some of the contents of TCFD application guide, a bit more on the examples on what could good look like. So perhaps just give me one moment for me to share my screen. So there are 4 key areas that will be covered under this part. So there will be the governance disclosure, there will be the strategy, the risk management, and finally there will be metrics and targets disclosure. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to Arina. You can take on the session.
Thanks, Joel, Mekim, and Suksim for that. So we all want to know now what good looks like, and I always believe it's good to also see hands-on what are the rest disclosing globally. When it comes to the TCFD application guide, when it comes to governance, these are the distinguishment of what basic looks like. So as I mentioned, board oversight, clarity on board oversight. There will be example next I'll share. Second is also how does the governance structure takes into consideration the climate related matters at the management level. Third is sustainability and climate related board credentials. Fourth is sustainability climate related trainings, which is what we are seeing has ramped up in Malaysia's board for the past 12 months. And fifth is sustainability and climate-related discussions in board meetings. Frequency is definitely considered, but effectiveness of the discussion is also quite critical. Six is sustainability or climate-linked remuneration. So how does this tie back to remuneration? So quite a number of discussions now looks at performance targets and also connecting to remuneration linked to ESG performance, including the climate performance. But the stretch, what we are seeing is going beyond basic to advanced level. It's having a separate committee when it comes to sustainability and climate related matters. So this slide, we'll have examples shortly, but here we have also outlined when it comes to the board oversight, the disclosure is really to show the oversight and accountability on the climate related matters, risks and opportunities, 3 things. It's important to also understand how the demand from stakeholders are increasing, how these are weaved into the strategic decision-making, risk management framework, and the financial planning, 3 key things. Board oversight definitely is also because there is a primary responsibility at the board level. Hence, it's important to understand as well whether it resides at the board as a whole or a subcommittee. So that clarification needs to be drawn up. The third part is also integrating this leadership and oversight. As I mentioned earlier, how it complements the Malaysia Code of Corporate Governance while integrating sustainability consideration is going to be needed in this enhancement of the corporate governance. So the key questions to ask is, who has the oversight? Is it the board risk? Is it the main board? How is this being discussed? Is there a separate climate-related matter committee or a sustainability committee? Second is, does the board have a clear view of sustainability and the climate risks and opportunities? What are these and how are these integrated in the long-term strategic planning? So if there is a discussion on approving business plan, how much of this are being discussed as in a connected manner? Third is, in the case of company group, has there been assessment and considered from a group-wide perspective? I think it has been also clarified earlier that it is a journey. Definitely what we're seeing, a lot of organizations will kickstart with the material group and business model first before looking at the other areas in other jurisdictions. So the fourth part is, how has board apprised sustainability related matters? What are the performance, the reviews, the matrix? And one thing we have also seen in the Malaysia landscape is few financial institutions have not only started measuring the finance emission calculation cut across the portfolio, but also starting to consider, what does this matrix mean? How brown or how green are their portfolio? This is no longer a qualitative discussion, but a quantitative discussion with clear finance emission numbers on different asset classes, whether it's loans, borrowings, mortgages. These are where we are seeing the advancement at this point. So the fifth one is, how frequent does the board convene meetings to deal with sustainability linked topics, including climate related matters? And the sixth is, how does board monitor and oversee progress against goals, targets for addressing climate related issues? So this is an example from Barclays. As you can see, there is 3 focus areas on the articulation of responsibility for the board and management. You can see that they have established a board climate committee that will oversee the conversation and the review, and they meet 4 times throughout a year in driving the ambition setting on climate change, advising the board on formalizing the commitment. What you've seen here that is unique is also they have a head of climate risk that was appointed in 2020 that will develop their climate risk methodologies and how management of climate risk is within the portfolio. Now, a lot of questions will say that, do you really need a head of climate risk? There is no one size fits all. And what we have seen is there is also a head of sustainability and ESG, whereby the demarcation is the climate risk head is responsible very much on outlining what I mentioned, the TCFD cadence. They have a reporting line to the chief risk officer and ultimately to the group exco and the governance as you've seen here. Where else there is a head of sustainability and ESG that will oversee the development of standards on early innovation of sustainable products and services and development. So this is also how they have demarcated the roles and responsibility. Now it's important, I outline here that different financial institutions, for example, the other examples you can see is Standard Chartered, whereby they have a separate sustainable finance group working group, and they also have Sustainability Forum and Climate Risk Management Forum. So different organizations have decided to set it up on a different manner, but the clear thing is how they outline the roles and responsibility is what we're looking for. When it comes to another example, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, what they have done here, as you can see, they have illustrated a board committee that's responsible and the frequency as well. And what you've seen here is they routinely appraise the risks and opportunities to quarterly reports and annual reviews. where else the EBRD board provides approval on the bank's environmental and social policy, covering both lending and internal operations. So here we have seen somewhere closer in our region, DBS, whereby they actually provide disclosure on the roles and responsibility of the board and the group management committee regarding ESG matters. As I mentioned, some would have it as a separate, some would have it connected as an ESG consideration. So for Swiss Re, what we have seen here is 3 board of directors committees are charged with overseeing the implementation and execution of its climate action plan. And the separate committees will report to the board of directors with clear description of their roles and responsibility. So I won't go through that in detail, but you can actually have a view that different organizations have different governance that is fit for purpose. So it's important to understand what you have existingly in your organization, where the enhancement or the upgrade are, so you do not reinvent the wheel, but you upgrade the wheel to make it effective to actually communicate and make decisions moving forward. In terms of asset management for Aviva, what we've seen is the board reviews the company's climate ambition, approve the climate risk appetite and business plan, including any climate-related matrix. The Aviva investors, they also integrate ESG factors as part of pay criteria across the firm and ensure ESG is reflected in remuneration. Now, in a discussion with a lot of the FIs in the market right now, it has started. There is already a discussion to also innovate how this remuneration connectivity is. Some are looking at more of a bonus, some is looking at it as a ESG performance remuneration, performance consideration. So there is no one size fit all, but I think it has given sufficient idea that it has come, and we have seen some of the large FIs are also starting to implement this in the local landscape. So the next part is when it comes to the sustainability governance structure, including the climate-related matters at the management level. So we've covered board. Now, at the management level, it's where that it gets the heavy work to be sorted. So having a clear structure and process is very critical, because ultimately someone needs to be accountable to identify, monitor, assess, and report in a timely and effective manner. There needs to be a clear responsibility relevant to the management level from business unit, risk management, corporate strat, finance, audits, and others. Now, this is not the holistic complete list, but these are at least the critical functions that need to take the first step before the rest come together when it comes to the training, when it comes to the RMs, when it comes to operations. So there are many approaches, but the idea is really to ensure that everyone has a clear view to handle what's key first. And when it comes to reporting and disclosures, there will be clear that there is a need to articulate what are the relevant reporting lines within the institution to disclose and report to ultimate oversight body. So the key questions that management needs to critically ask is, what are the roles and responsibility at various levels in integrating sustainability and climate-related matters into the business strategies and processes? Who are the various parties involved? How are they measured and managed to ensure alignment? Now, in a simplified manner, you would need a RACI model. Roles, who do you keep informed? Who needs to be connected? So having that is very critical. Second is, what are the process to review climate-related risk management policies, managing the matters, including the consideration? And the third is really to implement and look at progress and consider this against this target setting. So if this process is relegated to one department, typically we will see it not being effective or the roadmap will get lengthened. But if it is done in a connected manner, the speed of implementation or upgrade or enhancement gets faster, because you can't enhance if you don't have a connected view of risks and opportunities and business plan and strategy. So this is where we're seeing that it's important to have that committee or network set up within that organization from day one. The next part is in terms of example. Here, as I mentioned, the Standard Chartered, they have outlined the committee that is being set up. They have assigned clear responsibility for the group's climate strategy to its newly created CSO. And the risks arising from climate change are managed by CRMO and CRO, and it's consisting of responsibilities from other mainstream financial risks. So this is where the connectivity that I've mentioned earlier that they have set up. In terms of closer to the region, for OCBC Bank Singapore, they did not provide the organizational chart, but they articulate that the board is responsible and there is a board risk management committee having the oversight. Now, as I mentioned, the Sustainability Council has been set up as what OCBC have done, is chaired by the group CEO. And that's where they will drive OCBC's sustainability strategy. That it is supported by a sustainability task force and working group to operationalize these strategies across the group. There is also a sustainable finance group to drive business development, promote investment. And for the group risk management, they are responsible to establish frameworks, policies. There is a sustainability stewardship group as well, dedicated team of ESG specialists, independently review transactions against the underlying ESG risk. So this is where we're seeing quite a number of organizations are moving towards this direction as well. So for insurance, this is Cathay Financial Holdings. The Chief Risk Officer leads the cross-company TCFD task force that manage the effect of climate-related risks on real estate, negotiable securities, corporate loans, and insurance products. The TCFD task force also report the supervision to the CRO each month and submits the annual report to the Risk Management Committee and Board of Directors. So for AXA Group, they have developed a multi-faceted governance mechanism covering the ESG and climate issues. So this structure shows how they approach, how their approach is to responsible investments. I won't go through that in detail, but for those in the insurance sector, you can have a look at AXA. They are one of the leading disclosures who have also started deepening in terms of how they manage TCFD. So when it comes to sustainability and climate-related board credentials, now this is very critical because it also requires further clarification. So one thing is, what are the knowledge and competencies to ensure these risks, ESG risks, are integrated into business strategy? It's important to also now have a look at the climate-related credentials, experience, individual biographies for board directors, board members. And it's also important to look at what are the climate-related skills, proficiencies, and experience that is relevant to be disclosed to instill the confidence that financial institutions is now taking material matters seriously moving forward. So the key questions is, number one, does the board possess the relevant knowledge, expertise, or is there a plan to continuously enhance the knowledge for board of directors and members? We definitely have seen quite a number of advancements in this area. Second part is, are the ESG skills included as part of the board skills matrix aligned with the long-term business strategy? What are the skills of each directors? Include ESG related proficiencies as disclosed. The third is really the board taking proactive measures to promote diversity of skills, experience, both in the board members when considering new board members. And the last is, who's responsible for evaluating sustainability competencies on the board? So if we look at the example, this is an NN group. This is just an example of the skill matrix identified by board level. They provide an overview on the range of knowledge, experience, background, including the related ESG experience. So for asset management, BMO Global Asset Management, they've also highlighted the director's experience, including environmental matters in the skills matrix, and these are being reviewed every year. So the next part is on sustainability and climate-related training. The important is really to disclose what are the initiatives undertaken, the training programs to build capacity of the board members and management on sustainability issues, including climate-related matters. So it's essentially to equip board with cutting-edge knowledge, keep them abreast on the changes in sustainability and climate-related developments, including climate science and regulatory changes. Those are the focus areas we're seeing. Second is understanding the sustainability and climate-related risks, comprehensive sustainability and learning programs, and what are the opportunities that the institution needs to consider. So the key questions to ask is really, does the FIs have continuous learning program for board and senior management? Second is, do you disclose the focus areas of the training programs conducted? Third is, what are the specific sustainability and climate-related training programs conducted for the board and senior management? And last is, do the sustainability training programs include practical exposures such as site visits, case studies, knowledge sharing sessions by other companies? So number 4 is very important because what we are hoping to see is not a theory, but there's a practical application. There's a deeper sector dives. There is a real assessment of risks and opportunities that the board is also overseeing. So one of the examples here is from NatWest. It is to look what they have actually disclosed is there is a concise structure that outlines how the climate governance operate for board committee, executive and management. There is also disclosure on the board knowledge and expertise. So for Swiss Re, they have also outlined where the board of directors undergo one-on-one training as part of the efforts to keep abreast with emerging trends. Now we have seen this, and also there are quite a number of FI boards that are going to this direction in the local arena. So it's very encouraging to also feedback that this trend is going to increase moving forward. The second part is the example from BMO Global Asset Management. Is where they encourage directors to continue efforts in training and upskilling on sustainability issues, roundtable discussions held on issues such as decarbonization and equity. So moving forward, we are seeing board of directors getting more active in public-private forums, partnerships, discussions, and so on and so forth. So the next part is we're talking about sustainability and climate-related discussions in board meetings. And a lot will be centered on not just on the frequency, but also how the agenda have been structured. What are the summary of the climate-related issues and initiatives deliberated? So the core component is really to be proactive in evaluating risks and opportunities. And the second part is the frequency on discussions. The questions is really how frequent the board and board committee discuss, and what are the key matters that have been discussed and debated at the board level. So one of the examples from the local scene is CIMB, whereby they've outlined the frequency of board meetings per year are disclosed, and sustainability issues discussed are deliberated by the board, which have been clearly outlined. And they've also took the liberty to share also what are the climate-related topics discussed by the board. So here they've talked about appetite for exposure for high-risk sectors, key sectors, policies such as NDP, no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation requirements. So these are some of the key things that they have advanced when it comes to discussions at the board level. So the other example from Swiss Re and Allianz Group is here they have specified that the board meets quarterly to discuss climate-related issues. And for Swiss Re, they outline the key responsibilities to sustainability and what are the focus areas discussed throughout the year as highlighted. So it becomes a clear transparency on what are the recent issues, and it's not something that stays every year as the same deliberation. When it comes to the other examples for asset management, BNP Paribas here, they've disclosed a number of times climate issues were addressed at board, and they've also outlined the roles and responsibilities when it comes to climate-related issues. So last part here is when you talk about linking board of directors, sustainability or climate-linked remuneration. These are few recommendations or appropriate mechanisms and structures is to also start looking at how this contributes to the organization's goals and metrics on sustainability and climate. The first part is really to consider 4 key dimensions. What are the internal and external targets? Second is how to keep track and measure progress on these goals. Third is time frame. And four is how to determine achievement of targets, what good looks like. So the key questions to consider is how are these goals and metrics first being deliberated, and how are these being disclosed as step one? Second is, what are the implications of performance on remuneration for board and top management? Third is specific sustainability and climate related goals matrix have been adopted and over what time horizons. So what we're seeing, a lot of FIs have started to commit on X amount of sustainable and green finance. That's a common goal that has been set. Some have started setting net zero targets, and with some with more near-term targets as well. So how are these goals matrix being determined? Who determines this goal? And last is how does the board and management monitor progress towards this established goal? So examples here from Standard Chartered, UK and UBS, they have linked, here we are seeing is they have linked ESG to further enhance objective, and they measure it via a quantitative and qualitative matrix and targets. They have also started measuring and form a 4% of group scorecard, and they incorporate into the long-term incentive plan, and also consider it as part of variable pay for the group management team and executive directors. For Allianz, they have looked at sustainability performance into the board remuneration. There's a range of related targets based on E, S, and G priorities. So what they have outlined here is the performance on an annual basis and provide further details on how these are integrated. For BNP Paribas, they have integrated the objectives and targets into the performance review, determination of annual remuneration, and all these are part of their BNP Paribas global remuneration policy. So on G7, when it comes to the separate committee on sustainability and climate related matter, this is where the stretch or the advanced level looks like, having a separate committee to oversee. As I mentioned, it's having a dedicated board committee. And this is typically done whereby there are complex strategies that requires very specific discussion. And also the roles and responsibility of this separate dedicated committee, they serve as a driver, critic, as well as knowledge center of sustainability for the institution. Now, this is quite common for the likes of Shell, for the likes of those we've seen in very high pressured board that is facing a lot of stakeholder activism. And we do see this trend potentially coming for financial institutions over a period of time as ESG or climate-related risks are gaining focus. So this will also requires directors with relevant sustainability competencies and experience to come to be able to drive a board effectiveness and balancing of the board's oversight and governance. So the key questions are, what are the objectives of this committee and how does this sit within the financial institution's overall structure? What are the roles and responsibility of sustainability committee? What's the frequency and how this composition will be decided, including the terms of skill sets, viewpoints, and input. Example here we see is for DBS, they've established a separate committee to focus on sustainability agenda and commitments. DBS have also articulated the roles of this committee together with frequency and meetings, number of meetings held. For AIA, they've addresses the sustainability matters through the ESG committee, disclose the overall governance structure and frequency, and the oversight of the strategy. For Nomura, they have established a committee as well with 5 sub-working groups, wholesale sustainability, climate risk, ESG, TCFD, environmental activities, and diversity and inclusion. So they've disclosed the discussions held by the respective committees as well. On strategy, I think it's key to focus here. when it comes to the TCFD on what are the guidance, for basic is identification of climate-related risks and opportunities, impact of climate-related risks, and the strategy. For advanced and stretch is scenario analysis, and as an opportunity to improve strategic resilience and explore climate vulnerabilities. So it's very simple to see how advanced, if they have started disclosing scenarios, that's where they have advanced to the more advanced level. So when it comes to the first component of the tree is identification of risks and opportunities. Here, the key questions to ask is, what are the risks and opportunities, and what are the operations and goals over the short, medium, and long term, as I mentioned? Second is, have they identified the relevant internal key risk indicators or measurement to monitor and to trigger action and respond? Also is to also consider, has the company considered opportunities? Is there a process to identify opportunities, such as creating sustainable finance products, services, playbook in relation to sustainability or climate change? So if we look at, for the advanced, ING Group has disclosed the current credit exposure for 5 of the sectors and set time-bound targets to align with science-based scenarios. So this is one example. We talk about scenarios. The second one is, The second one is on Cathay Financial Holdings. They've identified the material climate risks and opportunities and potential financial impact over the short, medium, and long term. And you can see that they've outlined digital finance trends, sustainable development, climate resilience as the focus areas of opportunities. So the next part is on Standard Life Aberdeen. They have identified the material climate change risks based on their scale. So they've started defining the scale of impact and likelihood across different time horizons. They've also disclosed how they assess materiality when it comes to risks and opportunities. So for impact assessment, or assessing how these opportunities would affect the business strategy and financial planning, 3 areas. One is how this is embedded. Second is institution-wide risk exposure. And third is reporting and disclosure. So the key questions is, how much effort and resources are required to handle or manage the risks and opportunities? What are the skill sets needed internally? Second is, what are the external data or information needed to assess climate-related risks and opportunities? This is exactly the discussion by JC3 when it comes to the data management as well. And the third part is, how often should risks and opportunities be evaluated, updated, given the rapid development, both science and regulations in this area? Fourth is, is there a transition plan or contingency plan in place to manage and address the impacts identified? So here we see Citibank. They have provided a breakdown on environmental and social impacts achieved through its financing and lending activities. For example, avoided greenhouse gas emissions from their renewable energy projects, energy efficiency finance. Citibank have also provided a breakdown of financing goals by environmental and social criteria, by region and business over a comparative period. So this is what they've outlined as the criteria and the matrix or report card, if I put it simply. For Swiss Re, they have described the impact of physical and transition risks on their core business and products, along with how they plan to manage the impact. You can have a look at their report in more detail. For asset management, legal and general, they have disclosed the investment assets which are exposed to climate change risks and opportunities. And they have shown the exposure based on sector asset values and sector carbon intensity. So as I mentioned earlier, some of the leading banks have started on finance emission calculation. It's also important now to understand the intensity, how brown or green their assets exposures are. So this is where the disclosures looks like when it comes to board oversight and how they actually devise a strategy moving forward. So the third part is on strategy risk appetite and how this strategy are being devised. And what you've seen here is, first is the risk appetite. So financial institutions definitely need to have clear definition of risk appetite, taking on and their stand when it comes to climate-related risks. FIs have also need to start disclosing how this risk appetite differs when it comes to their existing risk portfolio. What are the deviation when it comes to different sectors? In terms of transparency, they should also consider position when it comes to risk management strategy and how they reflect their strategy in the business activities. So the questions to ask is, what is the financial institution stance when it comes to climate change and sustainability? Some already have a stand on coal or no new coal financing. That's just one example. And the second part is, are sustainability and climate change incorporated in their vision and mission? The third is, are their institution-wide awareness program to cascade this strategy to employees, including the focus on ESG elements. So the next part is we'll show example. This is where NatWest have outlined. They provide an overview of how their climate ambition and approach is when it comes to managing the climate risks and opportunities. They talk about the speed of transition. They talk about what are the harmful activities, how do they champion climate solutions, how do they embed this in their culture and decision-making, and also making their own operation climate positive by 2025. So for Cathay Financial Holdings, they've integrated it into their decision-making process and disclose their overall strategy to respond to environmental and social challenges. So they've outlined here what they decide to when it comes to their lending, whether they decline, approve, or they start to look at various aspects like impact investing, or they look at asset management, mandating and monitoring some of these high-risk sectors or assets as well. So for BMO, their strategy is to embed sustainability and apply a variety of practice to capture opportunities and manage the key areas. Here, they've also outlined risk management strategy, which is also factored into their framework and policy. So there is two components. One is on strategy, one is on risk. For S4, which is the advanced level, is definitely having a scenario analysis as an opportunity, and also focusing on where the business growth areas would be to improve the strategic reliance and also to explore climate vulnerabilities. Now, those who are advanced level, they started to look at, in different scenarios over time, what are the different conditions and how do they put a strategy to capture the business opportunities when it comes to these different scenarios. So here, what we have outlined here is definitely quite a few areas to consider when it comes to advanced level. And what we have shown here is, for example, from Barclays, what they have done is to link time horizons to the identified climate transition risks and consider the impact to portfolio and operations. So considering timeframes is quite critical. What we have seen here is also recognizing the different climate-related risks and opportunities. There is granular discussion now on what the key sectors and teams are. For example, recycling, efficient building strategies, stranded assets on non-green buildings, access to new markets, EV infrastructure, public sector incentives, having discussions or access to new assets or locations needing insurance coverage. Those are the key strategies discussions that we have also seen some players are already starting to look at positioning. So when we come to strategy, financial institutions will start to also think about, aside from scenario, what are the variables, assumptions, and results, because all these will feed into how they then think about a comprehensive report. How do they navigate their strategies, but they also put forth how resilient would their business be? What are the value at risk to their portfolio under different scenarios? And they will start to look at what are the opportunities by geographical location as well. So for the stretch, in terms of scenario analysis and opportunities, key questions they will ask is, what are the various scenarios readily available? So they will start to look at the scenarios developed by IEA, International Energy Agency, IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on climate change, and these are those commonly used to assess future vulnerability of climate change. They would also start to look at different industry, value chain position, customers, stakeholders, geography, or economic sectors. Investors will then start to also consider potential plan on future performance when it comes to what are the key focus areas. And they will start to look at the parameters, targets set against performance as well within the scenario analysis. So if we look at Barclays, this is one example where they disclose the magnitude and impact of climate risk to main segments. Here you can see that they have the heat map to identify what are the scenarios for early action, late action, and no additional action. And the outcome of scenarios on the impact to their wholesale credit, mortgages, and cards. So they've also outlined how does this affect their scenario, based on the scenarios, how does this affect them. For NatWest, they've disclosed the scenario analysis approach and the NGFS scenarios to perform modeling and analysis. So here they've also outlined the linkages on the probability of default, credit requirements, and the loss given default as well. So for NatWest, they've disclosed both the transition and fiscal risk model, what are the impact for oil and gas companies in 2050, and the underlying estimates used for each of the scenarios. For Aviva, they've tested the methodologies for different partners and different classes of assets, and they start to look at what are the actual weather-related losses versus the expected losses by year, business units, and net of reinsurance. So for Alliance Group, they have tightened their coal approach in both proprietary investments and property casualty underwriting by restricting companies that plan new thermal coal assets. Targets have also been set to transition all operational on greenhouse gas emissions from insurance underwriting portfolios to net zero greenhouse gas emission. They've also performed sensitivity and scenario analysis for time with time horizons up to 2050 and scenarios ranging from 1.5 degrees to 4 degrees of average warming by the end of the century. So maybe I'll pause here, Joelle, and pass back to you. I know we've gone through, but I hope that has given everyone a good insight of what good looks like for TCFD.
All right, thank you, Arina. So before we go on a short break, maybe Arina, maybe you want to take maybe 2 questions. I have 2 questions.
Sure.
From the participants. So the first one is, can independent board be accountable for sustainability-linked remuneration? So this is in relation to independent board of director as opposed to executive board.
So I think it goes back to the corporate governance and the roles of the independent board. There is a need to align with the board's, how the board structure has been set up. But typically for independent board, they would need to demonstrate how they have actually considered their roles and responsibility. But I think the remuneration linked performance is very much so for the executive directors, very much, where else the independent board members have their role to play and certain mechanisms based on, again, the efforts, and they are remunerated accordingly. So the principles needs to be adhered to, but it's important to now relook at how this is being enhanced.
Thank you very much, Arina. The next question is, what is the best practice when it comes to sustainability structure? Does this fit with second line or the first line or a combination?
So I think based on the examples that we shared, there's no one size fit all. And as you can see, having the right, what we're seeing in the local market is not just reorganizing or enhancing, but it's really also to understand what's the current level of competency, what's the roles and responsibility, and bringing them to an enhanced level, or enhancing or building up the existing team that is looking at some of these roles and responsibility. I think what's critical is, as I mentioned, not to reinvent the wheel or disrupt the wheel, but to also look at how the connectivity is and where the enhancement and capability building needs to be enforced into the organization, so that you will have an effective governance structure that can start to look at some of these emerging areas.
Okay, thank you very much, Arina. We will now have a short break. Due to time constraint, we'll have a 5 minutes break. We'll come back at 5:03. Thank you. Okay, 5 minutes is up. I apologize for wrongly mentioned the timing earlier. We are supposed to reconvene in 5 minutes at 4:33. So with that, can I bring Arina back to continue the next part of the session for today?
Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks Joel. So the next part is we talk about is on risk management, what the basic looks like and what are the guidances. So the first is really on process to identify the climate-related risks. Second is managing, and third is integrating this into the overall risk management. So the first part is when it comes to risk, identifying and assessing risks. Three things is what are the existing and emerging regulatory requirements when it comes to the climate change and other relevant factors. Second is the risk classification framework used. And the third is the risk terminology definition used on existing risk classification framework. So what we've seen here, there are examples that you can see, I'll show in a short while, but the second part is also when it comes to the disclosing the management, the process is also to look at the financial institution's risk management process and control. Disclose the identities of individuals and functions responsible for the oversight of this risk and relationship with the business operation. So risk and business needs to now coordinate. And the questions to ask is what management process are when it comes to managing this. For example, is there a climate change risk inventory or taxonomy? Second is what are the exposure when it comes that needs to be managed, such as is it flood, hurricanes, technological changes? And also what are the priorities when it comes to climate related risks? What are the process to prioritize? What are the materiality determinations for strategic planning? And the last one is, has the FIs established relevant risk management governance to monitor, for example, the risk committee as we mentioned. So the third part is when it comes to integration, is to look at what are the processes to integrate. Is there an elaboration of timeframes in the overall risk management framework discussion? So definitely FIs now needs to start thinking about explaining how this process integrate with the overall risk management framework. The fourth part is the advanced level. It will start to look at key things. If you look at the questions to ask is, does the FIs disclose how climate risk related risks were identified? So this is where a stakeholder management strategy comes into play. How do they track regulatory development or engagements with key stakeholders? Second part is how do they disclose the climate risk identification and assessment tool use? Is there an economic scenario planning, stress testing, vulnerability assessment scales? What are the various tools that has been put in place? Third is there a methodology to assess credit rating impacts under a 2 degrees climate scenario? And fourth is, if there are still climate related aspects, and how is this established in the indicative timeline to do so? So on top of that, when it comes to the advanced consideration is also what are the process to manage? So when it comes to management, what is FI's courses of action to manage this identified risk? What are the relevant training or employee readiness planning program? Now it's important because once the board and senior management are well informed, the question then is actioning on risk management. So a lot of questions now will also ask, what would RMs need to do when it comes to their roles as well. The fourth one is really for insurers and Takaful operators. What tools or risk models are being used when it comes to product development and pricing? How these risks are generated in terms of the rising propensity and severity of climate events that are being managed. So the other part when it comes to the stretch is integrating this into the overall. So the questions to ask is how are these being considered for new transactions, newly onboarded borrowers? What are the in-depth disclosures in this area? Second is also, has there been any commitments to support client in terms of mitigation of physical and transition risks? How are these being enabled? It's having that deeper discussion at the RM's levels as well. Third one is financial institutions now needs to consider how these are being considered when it comes to credit and investment decision-making. And the fourth one is to develop sector-specific approach to deal with financing or insuring for sensitive or high-risk sectors. Last but not least is how these will provide additional risk mitigation measures. So quite a number of financial institutions have now started to build ESG negative screening scoring within their organization, but the next part is really to build on the mitigating factors as well that will adjust the scoring. So what we're seeing is not many financial institutions will now need to advance to understand what are the mitigating factors, so that, you know, it's not just a pull out, it's not exclusion, it's not negative screening, but to work with the key sector players and also to enable the transition and the financing required to transition. So if we look at Barclays, they have actually delivered a climate risk integration plan to support the elevation of climate risk to their principal risk within its enterprise risk management framework. Now, I won't go through that in detail, but what they have done is also to outline how does this impact their credit risk, market risk, treasury and capital risk, operational risk, and reputational risk as well. So there is a certain form of structure. Barclays also have provided a concise overview of how they further elaborate the identification, management, into these various risks. Where else what we see for NatWest, they have talked about how this is integrated to risk management framework. They also talk about the ongoing plans, timeframes to fully embed climate risk management into business and processes. They've also disclosed the impact on the existing principal risk and also what are their priorities when it comes to these areas. So for BNP Paribas, they've incorporated the environmental and climate related risk factors into the key risk drivers, as well as they've also looked at how these align with their risk materiality. So for BNP, they've also incorporated this into their forward-looking risk assessment. Swiss Re has then used existing processes and instruments to address their risks. What they've done for physical and risk is they specify what are the business operations impacted. And they've also outlined the transmission channels when it comes to the asset classes and how this is linked to the NGFS scenarios. So you can see that they talk about what are the carbon consumption or pricing that they are monitoring, what are the trend and weather forecasting when it comes to physical risk and physical exposures analytics as well, and how this linked to their real estate sector. So for BlackRock, they have outlined the approaches to enhance the capability and incorporate the climate change risk into their existing risk management framework. This is for asset management. So for matrix and target, the component here we've outlined is when it comes to what are the guidance, there is already key climate related matrix outlined here. As you can see, greenhouse gas measurement, client engagement, capital deployment, remuneration. What we are seeing is also when it comes to key climate related targets, the expectation for basic is to describe the targets used by FIs to manage risks and opportunities and performance against targets. They've also described how these targets are in line with the climate matrix and anticipated regulatory requirements, market constraints, and other goals. So the advanced level, we will show example in the next few slides. So when it comes to the key climate related matrix, you can see M1 and M3. This distinguishes the basic and the advanced level or the stretched level. And what you see here is in terms of disclosure and reporting expected, as what Busa has also shared earlier, is also to look at on top of the emissions recommended disclosures on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, is to also ensure there's clarity when it comes to the measurement, the types of measurement, whether you're using direct proxy or accounting standards, the methodology, scope boundary, and emission factor, changes in absolute and relative amount over time, whether it's acquisition, divestments, or institutions policies, how these results are connected, business unit strategy and financial results. And when it comes to the criteria, is to also look at what are the operational performance and position, and what are the financial performance and position. So it's not just looking at from an enterprise level, but also from an investment, lending, and portfolio level. So how can organizations structure disclosures from basic to stretch? Here you can see for basic is the greenhouse gas emissions, historical and current greenhouse gas emissions. And the stretch one is to go beyond when it comes to the scenarios. And when it comes to the stretch, you can see that there is additional area when it comes to internal carbon pricing, price on each ton of greenhouse gas emissions used internally by an organization. For performance, the stretch target will also start to talk about the impact of opportunities on financing performance, connecting this to the financing performance, and the impact of risks and opportunities on the financial positions as well. So this gives you a distinguishment between the basic and the stretch. So when it comes to the greenhouse gas emissions, what you see in the basic is the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And when you see the basic at a minimum is very much covering the business travel and employee community, but that's still very much on what a bank does and how it operates. For the stretch, it is starting to look at the absolute scope 3 greenhouse gas emission, finance or insured emissions by asset classes. What are the weightage of average carbon intensity portfolio exposure to carbon intensive companies, physical emissions intensity, economic emissions intensity, and the additional forward-looking elements or analysis. So what we've seen in the local market is quite a number of banks have started to go towards beyond the basic, because the basic will not be able to help you to strategize on your broader business plan and strategy. The stretch is where quite a number of banks, FIs have started to move towards. So this is quite critical to distinguish. It's not just important to look at the basic, but also how the stretched greenhouse gas emissions will help to improve the resilience and stress testing of the risks and opportunities as well. So some of the examples, for example, like DBS, they have provided sectorial scope 3 finance emissions baseline based on prelim results and corresponding reference scenarios. They've also provided disclosure on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So here you can see they've covered power, real estate, automotive, and aviation and shipping. So they've also talked about the reference scenarios where they've looked at IEA, some they've looked at NZE, and some they've also, for shipping, they've also looked at the Poseidon principles as well. So for Allianz Group, they have a concise disclosure on methodology to calculate portfolio carbon footprint for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And for Aviva, they've disclosed the weightage, the weighted average carbon intensity matrix broken down by different markets. And for BNP Paribas, they have a concise disclosure of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and trend analysis from 2012. So for BlackRock, they also have a disclosure on the weighted average carbon intensity matrix at the fund level. So they've outlined this to provide the calculation and quantitative comparison. So how can organizations structure their climate-related matrix from basic to stretch when it comes to transition risk? Basic, you would look at here, they talk about the concentration of credit exposure with carbon-related assets and business activities by different key sectors. The stretch one would also now start to look at the amount and extent of activities that are vulnerable to transition risk. So they talk about what's the volume of real estate collaterals highly exposed to transition risk, what are the distribution of borrowers or customers related risk ratings, and the transition heat map by sector, geography, and technology. So this is an example by Standard Chartered where they provide disclosures of exposure numbers for loans and advances to high carbon sectors. When it comes to physical risks, the basic would be proportion of portfolio exposed to physical risks, where you see that they start to define what are the FI's own property and operations vulnerable under the physical risk, such as flood, heat stress, or water stress. The one on the stretch is very much looking at the proportion of portfolio. So it's no longer just looking at the FI's own assets, but going towards the portfolio. And they start to look at number and value of mortgage loans in flood hazard risk map. So quite a number of FIs have started to look at how the identification of risk down to the postcode level when it comes to these hazards and risk map. The other part is also to look at climate adjusted loan to value ratios and the correlation between asset value and the extreme events. So when we look at Standard Chartered, they provide the disclosure based on forward-looking physical risks down to the property level. So they talk about how this flood, wildfire, storm, sea level rise, and across number of operating locations, Korea, Indonesia, and globally. So they've started to define based on geographical. For AXA Group, they provide a disclosure on the proportion of portfolio which is with exposure to real estate investments vulnerable to physical risk. So when it comes to climate related opportunities, the basic has been outlined here. For example, the net premiums or insurance related to energy efficiency and low carbon technology. There is the percentage of resilient infrastructure, how many of clients are in hybrid and EVs, financing the products and services for the transition to low carbon economy, and exposure to green activities when it comes to the green portfolios that they have. For the stretch is what we've shown in the example, the avoided emissions. So how they finance clients and how the products are helping to avoid greenhouse gas emissions as compared to other products. And second is climate-related CAPEX intensity within the portfolio, such as the percentage of CAPEX. So for Standard Chartered, they've provided a disclosure on enhanced requirements on thermal coal clients with clear time horizons. For Aviva, they've provided the matrix and tools to monitor the alignment with global targets and climate change mitigation and to monitor the risk appetite. Aviva also provide a concise disclosure when it comes to the proportion of green assets investment portfolio, including investment in low carbon infrastructure, green, social, and sustainability bonds, sustainability-linked loans, and climate transition funds. So when it comes to client engagement, and this is very critical to strategy and opportunities, the basic one is very much focusing on what are the number of total proportion of engagements, proportion of portfolio with engagements on this as a key topic, whereas the stretch one is really defining the outcomes of these engagements. Where are the positive progress? Where are the advanced interventions? And where the transition plans would be when it comes to supporting clients to transition. And some are also looking at transition financing when it goes towards low carbon economy. So these are the 5 focus areas when it comes to advancing on client engagement is to set the scene, establish where your client's starting point is, the position, open up the dialogue. Second is to assess their current position and ambition. Some may have outlined a net zero target and transition or renewable energy target. Some may have not. So the third is to support the client to design what their transition finance plan looks like. Fourth is to structure the financing solution, support the clients. And fifth is to review and also to look at how these will advance the net zero agenda in terms of the financing activity as well. So when it comes to the capital deployment, here you can see that the disclosure is very much on the amount of CapEx, financing investment deployed towards climate-related risks and opportunities, looking at loans, financing, and investment assets. What are the share of financial assets based on the classification by green taxonomy, for example, by Bank Negara's CCPT, Climate Change and Principle-Based Taxonomy, and the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance. Where else for remuneration is to look at the proportion that is linked to sustainability considerations and sustainability-related KPIs. So when it comes to how organizations can structure their disclosures for stretch disclosures, here, as I mentioned, internal carbon price is going to be quite key when they look at business activity product lines. And these are very much proxy that are being developed as internal taxes or fee, similar to like intra-company, but consideration is also to look at the transfer pricing. Because all these is really to drive a behavioral change towards incentivizing emissions mitigation and investment in various low carbon opportunities. For shadow carbon price, this is a theoretical cost or notional amount that the organization does not charge, but they can be used in assessing the economic implications or trade-offs, such as risk impacts, new investments, net present value of projects, and the cost benefit of various initiatives. So this is where you see that the internal carbon price is a mechanism to get towards emissions and reduction strategy, where else the portfolio alignment or portfolio balancing is to look at the convergence between the emission profile and how the sector will decarbonize to achieve the climate goals. So when it comes to the portfolio, is to look at what are the sector decarbonization strategy, to what extent the FIs would be able to exert influence, transition with the key sector players, what are the long-term and intermediate portfolio target setting to support some of these transition and temperature goals, and what are the metrics to quantify where the portfolio warning is. So when it comes to the next part on performance and financial position, on performance, there are percentages such as weighting, description, percentages, as you can see in some of the examples that we showed earlier. But definitely what everyone is looking for is what are the expected losses or value at risk, or the different implications from a financial perspective under different climate scenarios. For financial position, it's also to look at what are the changes in the carrying amount of assets due to exposure, due to physical and transition risk, and how this changes the liability and equity due to the increase or decreases in some of the assets given the strategy. So for Standard Chartered, they've provided a disclosure on the incentive structure applicable to their employees, how these are linked for their chief risk officer, climate risk team, sustainable finance team, and even down to the property team or clean tech team and supply chain management or net zero steering group. For asset management, BNP Paribas, they have a concise disclosure on forward-looking assessment and also setting intermediate targets in the three of the highest emission sectors. For AXA, they have a disclosure on the long-term portfolio target setting to support the meeting of temperature goals in the Paris Agreement using the IEA 1.5 degree scenario. So when it comes to the key climate-related targets, there are a few areas to consider, but more importantly, is what are the questions to consider is whether the target is absolute or intensity-based. Quite a number of FIs definitely would go towards intensity-based because financing still need to grow. And then to also look at the relevant time frame over where the target will apply, whether are you going to hit the target in the next 10 years or 20 years, or you're going to rush towards the end of 2050 to hit the target when you may be late to position by then. And also to think about what are the relevant time frame, what are the base year, key for performance indicators used against targets, and how these are aligned to external pathways. So the idea is really to understand, given these various scenarios, what are the climate-related targets, testing of resilience under various outcomes. Again, the objective is to ensure that you're not left with stranded assets and you're not a late mover when it comes to some of this scenario planning and discussions. And more importantly, is to support the broader sector to decarbonize. So for Barclays, what they've done is to provide an illustration of how their portfolio would align with their target roadmap. They have produced an expanded Scope 3 finance emission quantification exercise so that they can also identify synergies working together with key sectors to decarbonize and to build this low carbon ecosystem by deploying finances to some of these low carbon technologies in potentially hard to abate sectors or maybe the brown sectors. And for Allianz Group, they have outlined their commitment to hit net zero by 2050 in business operations and proprietary investment. So this is where they start to align how they are moving towards their net zero target. So maybe Joel, I'll pause there and probably take some Q&A.
Thank you, Arina. Thank you for the sharing. I hope that it has been informative for all the participants here today. So there are a few questions that were raised by the participants. So perhaps I'll direct some of them to Arina. So the first one is, in terms of disclosure, for example, terms of reference, would board oversight on sustainability in general be sufficient, or do they need to explicitly mention climate-related matters? So this is in relation to TOR. It's just, in the TOR, just mentioning of sustainability, the board is, looking at sustainability sufficient, or should they explicitly mention climate-related matters as well?
So the short answer is it should have climate-specific related matters. Having sustainability is no longer sufficient because there is no clarity on how this climate-related matters risk is being disclosed. So unless the board's decision is it's embedded and there is other alternative to disclose under sustainability, these are the components of climate within the sustainability ambit, and that's clearly defined somewhere else. Definitely, it's important to show and demonstrate that the board is discussing climate-related risks and opportunities, deciding whether the risks and opportunities are material or not. So there is no one way to disclose. The board can disclose that they talk about sustainability in the TOR, but there is clarification what the sustainability means, which covers climate TCFD, and going down to the granular detail now, how these connect back with performance and targets, because it's not just one dimension. You also need to now see what are the climate related targets that the board need to approve. So I don't think board can, it's not just writing a TOR, it's really actioning and once these are being formalized, for sure you will see various components coming from the risk management, from the strategy, from the scenarios to the remuneration end to end. So for I would say the board TOR is just writing what you have, but you first need to have all these engines up and running before you can even put out a statement to say that you have this.
So I guess it provides more clarity to the readers or to the users of the information that the board is also looking at climate-related matters specifically, because it is of significant importance to the regulators as well on how banks, how financial institutions are managing climate-related risks and opportunities. Okay, the next question, also somewhat relating to governance structure kind of question. It's on how practical for ERM to assume the sustainability role or function. For example, responsibility to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So I would assume ERM, what the participant were meant was the risk management team, the enterprise risk management team. So how practical are they? Is it for them to assume the sustainability role or function?
So what we have seen is definitely within an organization, there is a need for a assigned role and responsibility to look at emissions or finance emission. That's a step one. Whether it resides with a function or a person, that has to now first calculate what are the quantification of emissions within various asset classes or activities. That's step one. Whether this person is within the sustainability team or whether it's in the risk team, that's a decision for the financial institutions to make. But what we have worked with is it's more efficient to ensure that there is clear ownership capability for the ones that is calculating finance emission, because what you will see happening is the risk team will also now need to understand how these are being calculated before the risk team starts to look at integration of these matrix into scenarios, risk measurement, calculation, likelihood, impact, severity, and all. So it's impossible to demarcate the usability of some of these capability. Of course, ideally, you want a one-stop shop that one team knows end-to-end, from calculation to risk management to strategy to credit to portfolio balancing. Everyone wants that, but realistically, there's an important to understand that it is a journey. Everyone needs to enhance, and as long as there is clear accountability assigned, who does what, then the organization will now need to know where they have to enhance their resources or position training in some of these areas. Now, if the organization is not very much decided on who to take on this responsibility, what we've seen is the best is set up the task force, cut across business, sustainability, and risk, and have this task force to own the process until it matures and stabilizes before the clear roles and responsibility is being split. So having that task force brings everyone around, and that helps to speed up, as I mentioned, getting these critical components together will actually help to plan ahead of what the next step is.
So what I gathered is it should be a task force, because I mean, like, it is a complex area. It is a climate change, or sustainability itself is a complex area, and it requires expertise, knowledge from across business divisions. So it's not really a one person or one man show being able to manage it. It has to bring in resources from other department as well. But perhaps the EM could be a coordinator for the task force. But I guess a task force would be ideal in that situation. Okay, so our next question would be, I mean, like, I've categorized some of these questions by the category, so I'll just go from top to bottom. So the next one is on this one. So ESG, or climate risk, is really at an infant stage, right? So how do we compute carbon emission? So even the country at national level does not provide guide to compute. How do we then provide the financial disclosure on climate-related matter?
So I think, yeah. So this is the calculation of finance emission, right? And what we've seen is, as what the audiences are aware, data on emissions are very hard to obtain. If we look at the over 1,000 listed companies on Bursa Malaysia, not all have started emissions calculation. Probably only the sector lead have started disclosing Scope 1, Scope 2, and only a handful have disclosed their Scope 3 emissions. So definitely it's a challenge if you're going to kickstart exercise from a bottom-up approach, asking from various companies on their emissions. But what's important is what we have worked with some of the financial institutions is to now look at what are the more critical data available. And one of the key things is also to leverage on proxy data while building on the bottom-up approach. So there is a top-down and a bottom-up. Naturally, the bottom-up will give you a more higher quality data because it's a real emissions by the companies that FIs are working with. But the top-down will actually provide a more complete view of what the portfolio is to navigate scenarios and stress testing while the bottom-up approach gets improved over time. So in that sense, some of the financial institutions that we have worked with, what the approach has been done, and also to actually develop the finance emission calculation is to actually leverage on PCAF, Partnership for Carbon Accounting Framework, whereby as long as they are a signatory, they get access to proxy data. What are the finance emissions data required? What are the methodologies? And they're able to get the emission factor proxy to calculate the finance emissions portfolio. So this will actually, the idea is not to go down to the specificity of the emissions, but to build a system that will help them to navigate risk and strategy, and over time, improve the quality of data, as I mentioned, bottom up, having the conversation. Once you have the system up, the finance emissions calculation and a number, you're able to have a conversation with the companies who have not started their emissions, and then have a meaningful conversation of what their transition strategy look like, what are the projects, how do they measure their emissions, are they resilient to carbon taxonomy? So those will come hand in hand in a market that hasn't, in a market whereby emissions is not really a mandated or regulated area.
Yep, thank you, Arina. I think there are multiple frameworks out there that addresses how to calculate carbon emissions. Of course, certain areas are a bit more complex than the other. So, for example, Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides a baseline of how do you inventorize, how do you calculate, how do you assess carbon emissions for Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And like Arina mentioned, the Partnership of Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, provide guidance on how, for banks or for larger, even for financial institutions, to calculate how do they assess, how do they estimate their portfolio emissions, portfolio finance emissions. And there are multiple approaches. So of course, like what Arina mentioned, data availability is crucial, right? And a lot of the smaller entities, I would say SMEs, they find it, at this point in time, find it challenging to obtain this information. But there are other approaches with users like Arina mentioned, proxy data to estimate those emissions number. So I guess it is a journey for the FIs, for the industry to work together as well to build capability in terms of how do you assess emissions. So yeah, I guess that's the way forward. Okay, so the next question would be, are any specific climate-related risks and opportunities for the consumer products? So this is relational consumer products and services sector. Are there any specific climate-related risks or opportunities for consumer products and services sector?
When it comes to this consumer products and services sector, the key thing is also always to look back at the emissions, resource management, circular economy. And the risks are very much no longer just looking at emissions, because there is also the discussion of zero single-use plastic roadmap, the levy that will be considered when it comes to consumer products. So there is a broader discussion on circularity, and the pricing is not just on emissions, but also how waste managements are being handled, how plastics are being managed in that circularity. So when it comes to the climate-related risks and opportunities for consumer products and services sector, the conversation gets broadened. The extended producer responsibility is a conversation for this sector, and definitely something that the sector needs to now consider modeling and stress testing some of these areas. So it's no longer just one-dimensional when it comes to climate-related risks and opportunities. The other part is worth mentioning is, while a lot of the conversation that we have here today is very much on climate and we talk about emissions, but there is also a broader discussions on biodiversity, waste management, water management, the whole ecological consideration. That's why the TCFD is just chapter 1. The next chapter will be TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Based Financial Related Disclosure. But it will be important to get the first engine right and eventually enhance the wheel over time, because as what we know, our economic and different sectors are not just one dimension. We don't just need to handle emissions. There is a broader resource management and value when it comes to resource. What are the input, output, outcome, and value created that we need to think about holistically? So when it comes to the sectors for consumer products and services sector, definitely efficiency is going to be still, energy efficiency is still going to be critical. Emissions are critical. Plastics, waste management, and definitely technology and you know, we've not even covered how this affects digitalization, you know, how digitalization, robotics, all will come to change the landscape for the consumer products and services sector.
Okay. So interestingly, Arina, you brought up TNFD. We had the questions on TNFD on when will regulators take into consideration of TNFD, where I replied, I mean, like, this is based on public information that Bank Negara has also started looking at nature-related financial risks. So in March this year, in March 2022, Bank Negara and also the World Bank together, they released a document on an exploration of nature-related financial risks in Malaysia, so TNFD. This report constitutes a first step towards assessing the exposure of Malaysian banks to nature-related financial risks. Of course, the caveat is, subject to limitations of data and all those. It will be further refined further. But it is not to say that the regulators are not looking at it. It is they have already started. They have already started looking at TNFD as well. But I guess they are taking a more nurturing approach where they, as usual, they will go through the discussion phase with stakeholders and gather feedbacks before they come up with any policies. Yeah. So I think going back to the questions on consumer products and services sector, right? I think a lot of the risks of climate-related risks is to assess what are the climate risks along the supply chain, because a lot of the time consumer products, the raw materials, some of these comes from different parts of the world, and different parts of the world are more susceptible to certain climate-related risks like flooding, heavy rainfall, and all this can affect the production of consumer products, right? And also how it can be delivered, the distribution of these products to the end consumers. So these are just some of the examples in addition to what Arina has mentioned earlier. Okay, I think we still have a bit of a time for a few more questions. So the next question would be, with so many diverse time periods adopted by different companies in terms of their strategies in addressing the impact and opportunities of climate risk, would it be advisable to have a core time period where all companies can use? So meaning, right, so we look at different companies and we also look at frameworks where they require organizations to determine their own time frame, right? So the question is, would it be advisable to have just one? So instead of every companies have their own different time horizon, would it be advisable to have a call time period where all companies can use? So for example, by 2030, by 2040, and by 2050.
I think when it comes to different time frame, there is a need to go down to the more granular discussion on what the financial institution's portfolio looks like. Because I think when you go down to the portfolio view, the exposure by different sectors and different geographies will drive different risks and priorities over different time frame. Now, why do I say that? For example, if we talk about the peak emissions for utility sector, for example, in Malaysia, our level of electrification as a country is much higher than Indonesia. So naturally, Indonesia still have a way to still have its level of space of time where they need to hit peak electrification, and that what it means is also for certain jurisdiction like Indonesia, the emissions may continue to go up before it will come down when a lot of the renewable energies and technologies are being deployed. But it doesn't mean that financial institutions will say that, no, I'm not going to do business in some jurisdiction because, you know, their intensity, their emissions are going to increase still over the next 5 to 10 years before it goes down. So these are things where it's not a time-defined scenario. It is a realistic geographical, as why we mentioned, it's not about a company setting your own time frame and build your own strategy. You first need to understand for different jurisdictions, different geographies, what are the external scenarios that will happen? What are the government policies that will drive the scenarios before the organization builds your own scenario to respond, to capture, to balance your portfolio of activities and strategy, considering the external factors. So it's really to look at what's happening externally first before you decide internally. Now, with that said, setting a time frame has to be, you know, it comes after you have had that clarity of what's happening before you decide on the time frame. If the objective is very much on, for example, product level or portfolio level, to spark sustainable finance, or to actually set the target that I'm going to grow sustainable finance or green financing or sustainability linked loan by X amount in the next 2030, 2040. Those are just a sub-component of strategy to respond to the bigger climate-related risks. So there's no one-size-fits-all, as I mentioned. But it comes back to what's the dynamics of the financial institutions? Where are the sectors that you are most vested in? Is it a scenario that you definitely have to respond faster or slower over the period of time because of, for example, some of the policies will come in different sectors. We talked about carbon taxonomy, but not many are fully aware that carbon taxonomy works in a different manner. For example, if you're in the shipping industry, there could be 3 types of taxonomy that the shipping industry has to address. Number 1, potentially, you have to consider the local country or jurisdiction taxonomy on carbon tax if it is being deployed in certain jurisdictions. Second is there is also the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism that is coming and how this will impact, for example, the shipping. The third is the IMO. If the IMO is going to set a levy on emissions, there is 3 types of jurisdiction and 3 types of taxonomy that, you know, it links back to emissions that the shipping industry players have to also anticipate and prepare for. So I would say that it's not so much of setting a time frame, but it's to understand within that sector, what are the critical issues and what are the urgency to position and how this will affect the financial performance and position, and how the financial institutions will now need to look at it from a different viewpoint where they can support the transition. So hopefully that gives some thoughts of it's not a straightforward answer, but it already gives a view of how to look at things in a very different context.
Okay. So linking to that, right? So you mentioned, some of the time frames. So this question refers, how does company determine the reduction needed to achieve net zero? So I think earlier you mentioned 2050, all those targets, right? So how does company determine how much is needed to achieve net zero?
So, sorry, Joel, can you repeat the question?
So the question is, how does company determine the reduction needed? So this is in relation to emissions reduction needed to achieve net zero by 2050.
So it comes back to how a company calculates their emissions as a start. Step one is to have clarity on the emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. If the ambition is to reduce scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, then most organizations that have started the emissions inventorization or calculation, they will start to look at emissions reduction strategy. So either they will go by key high emissions sectors and clients and start to have engagement, because some clients will already have a certain promise that if I continue some of this financing, I will reduce my emissions over time, as a promise to continue the relationship with the financial institutions. But if the customers does not have any plan at all and they're in high emission sector, they could potentially be in a sunset business. Coal power plant players that doesn't have a transition plan, that's one. So it comes back to the financial institutions whether would their decision is to at one point transition away or work together with these players on a transition plan, and also to have a deeper conversation of what the transition looks like. So for the financial institutions, it's a bit more challenging because yes, you can choose to move away from some of these activities and go towards green. But the reality down the ground on the market is there's still a huge room to educate the broader sector to go towards green project. And there are a lot of projects, but they may not have been labeled in a way because there is no measurement matrix, processes, framework in place that enable these projects to be classified as green, to go for green financing and efficient projects. So in that sense, for financial institutions, if their aspiration is to get to net zero, including portfolio, it's going to be a conversation with the sector key players, leading players, to actually work with them to transition and not just deciding on portfolio level strategy or rebalancing. So hopefully that gives you some thoughts of what needs to be done if the aspiration is to get to net zero.
Okay, thank you very much, Arina. I think we are at the end of the session for today. So once again, thank you everyone for putting in your questions. I think because of the time constraint, some of these questions can be directed to the session for tomorrow. So because today's one, the objective mainly is to introduce TCFD and also to share what are the requirements within the TCFD recommendations and also the TCFD application guide and the examples for it. For some of the questions where they are more relating to approaches, they are more relating to how do you do scenario analysis. So we will share some of these in tomorrow's session. So just to recap again, so tomorrow's session will be from 3 to 5:30 as well. So we will cover implementation path for first-time adopter, as we are aware, we know that some of the organizations out there are still at an early stage. So we will introduce how can you if you are a first-time adopter or early adopter, right? How do you approach this? We also share a bit more on the resources to implement the TCFD recommendation, the challenges, practical approaches, and we'll have the panel discussion. So on tomorrow's speaker list, right, we have Pravin. Praveen is our partner from the Climate Change and Sustainability Services Department based in Singapore. He has vast experience in terms of scenario analysis, in terms of helping clients to assess climate-related risks. And on the panel, we have Matthew Nelson. Matthew Nelson is our EY Oceania's Chief Sustainability Officer. He's also our former global leader on climate change. So he will be the moderator for tomorrow's session, which would be very, very insightful and interesting because he brings with him a lot of knowledge in terms of what are other people doing, right? So on the panel itself, we have Junaid Iqbal, Director of Sustainability from AIA Malaysia. We also have Sebastian Soler. He is the Global Head of Energy Transition and Environment from BNP Paribas. We also have Norman Ali. Norman Ali is the CFO, ESG and Sustainable Finance from HSBC Group. We also have Ryan from Standard Chartered Bank. He is the Director, Environmental and Social Risk Management. So as you can see, we are in it for a treat tomorrow. We have a panel, speakers where they have a lot of knowledge that can be shared. So I hope you enjoy today's session and also participate in tomorrow's session as well. With that, before I end, we would like to get a few feedback questions. Perhaps Michelle, you can put that on. So there are two questions that we wanted to request feedback from the participants today. So did you find the workshop useful? Very useful, neutral. And also, was the workshop effective in increasing your understanding of climate-related disclosures? So I think today's session, as always, right, time constraint, we have about 2.5 hours to go through today's content, and I hope that you find it insightful and interesting. Again, just to reiterate, today's session is recorded and will be uploaded on IFHIM's platform, including their YouTube channel. So with that, thank you very much for everyone's participation to allow us to end on time. Thank you very much, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.